thing I love about cybersecurity is it forces innovation because the bad actors out there are certainly motivated. And they come from, say, multiple places, right? They could be nation state, they can be your basement hacker, it can be anything. But there's a lot of money to be made. And with that, there's a lot of attacks going on.
There are two things we want to talk about: the security versus productivity, employee experience. Secondly, the cost versus rewards of mitigating risk. I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm sure we've all been in organizations where there was, I don't want to say draconian security policies, but security policies such that really impacted productivity, workflows, things like that. And organizations should seek to minimize that impact, on productivity. Security doesn't need to be a tax. But again, it goes back to what we were saying earlier, is that then it needs to be contextualized in, with the business. You need to understand, how the business needs to operate, and then work with those stakeholders within the business, then to implement effective security controls that have that have a real impact, but not necessarily that are draconian, such that they affect worker productivity. And I've lived in various regimes and worked through all that, and I can say that it's something you absolutely need to be focused on, because it can change very quickly based upon what the perceived threat landscape is versus what the real threat landscape really is. So what I think is key is that, security needs to prioritize what the impact might be from something as best they can. And then the business needs to understand then what that means in terms of their business risk. Again, we keep going back to that. And and then as they invest, what is the ROI going to be on those security investments? Because at the end of the day, the business is accountable for the outcomes, overall business outcomes. And security obviously has their responsibility to ensure that risk, that risk tolerance is being met, and that those are being appropriately addressed. And that's, in that whole assessment, right? So at the end of the day, the business teams own it, but the productivity and otherwise, and security has to have that empathy and understanding, and they have to speak that common language of risk to work productively together, break down those silos.
I echo that. Carl, as a board member, two things that we usually ask to do. Number one is to weigh the need for robust security measures against the impact on productivity and employee experience. Secondly, we oftentimes task to ensure that the cost of mitigating risk are justified by long-term rewards, right? For example, addressing tech debt, replacing end-of-life software may require significant upfront investment, but the long-term benefit far outweigh the risks of security breaches, right? So tech infrastructure complexity, as 37% of the organization report, is a key challenge today. It's essential for board and then senior leadership to guide the organization toward a more strategic, informed approach to balancing these competing needs.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head with tech debt. I mean, any organization that's been around a while will have tech debt. In fact, our report stats said 37% of orgs say tech infrastructure is too complex to uphold basic security measures, right? So that complexity tends to grow over time, and that creates that technical debt. And then if you look at further deeper and from the report, over half of orgs say they're still using end-of-life software. And so you can see, organizations are having a tough time kind of keeping up and understanding where they need to apply, security measures, where they need to invest in their infrastructure or services that they're consuming. And often they don't have a good view of that in the picture because, let's say you have a system that's running kind of in the background for 15 years and that asset's been running and maybe it hasn't been patched or kept up to date, but it's still running. You haven't had any issues, let's say, per se, or that you know about. But how do I know when I should look at that as a threat? How much of a threat is that really to everything, right? And they don't have that visibility, don't understand that, right? And that's, again, what your comments on the board is that, IT infrastructure, business infrastructure, everything, it's incredibly complex today. You may be using cloud-based services, you may have a combination on-prem, back-end databases, different authentication solutions, different ways to you'll have a myriad of solutions in many cases. And so, seeing that entire digital landscape and translating it back up to something that board, again, can understand, you need to take out the complexity and, relate it to something that they can see and say, oh, okay, this is what's happening to my business. by virtue of me not taking these investments or doing this or upgrading my infrastructure and all that. And this represents a big threat there. So it gives them a way to kind of figure out how to balance these things, right?
Yeah, that's why exposure management is really essential, right? In helping organizations find the proper balance between security and operational efficiency.
Yeah, and it's again, it goes back to that holistic view of the attack surface, right? So, what's interesting is like IoT devices. Half the organizations report that their IoT devices, they'll manage will rise in 2025, and I think that's just natural. Is more, you want to enable the mobile, user, for example, and they have made multiple ways. They may have an iPad, they may have an iPhone or an Android device, or there may be other things they're attaching to their sensors that are being leveraged in their infrastructure, cameras, security, whatever. Those are just growing. At least, with the Internet of Things, I can't remember what they were saying, but they're talking about 2 billion connected devices, I think, something like that, in 2020. And you can only imagine what that looks like now. And think about all the connected devices you have at your house, if you look at that. Um, the other thing about that balance is that, aggregated data, instead of looking at your data in different silos, you alleviate those blind spots because now you can contextualize across your entire infrastructure what's happening or what you're seeing or what's being added or where the threats are. And so that makes it much easier then to prioritize and address those. And then finally, what you can do based upon that kind of aggregated view is, again, goes back to being able to categorize risk based on your business impact and things like that. So the end result is a much more strategic role with security versus it being just another service that's trying to do things. It creates that opportunity for it to be the business partner and not just kind of another thing that business has to work around or work with, but not necessarily in the context of moving that business forward.
Well, I've learned so much from you today, Carl. I'm sure things evolve all the time in cyber. I'm sure we have a lot more to talk about, maybe 6 months from now or a year from now. I look forward to doing that again with you.
Yeah, no, I'd love to talk again about some of these other things that we're working on. It's the thing I love about cybersecurity is it forces innovation because the bad actors out there are certainly motivated. They come from multiple multiple places, right? They could be nation state, they can be your basement hacker, it can be anything. But there's a lot of money to be made, and with that, there's a lot of attacks going on, and so it's so important and so interesting. So I guess I'll close out the meeting for today, and I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Any of the related content we mentioned you can find in the side panel. And be sure to send the on-demand version of this webinar over to your colleagues if you liked what you heard today. Again, thank you so much, Helen. Really enjoyed our time today again, and look forward again to talking to you in the future.